Today, we're diving into an epic story, the 100-year journey of a nation in the making. It's a story of rebellion, of politics, and of the powerful, often messy, birth of modern India. And it really gets you thinking about a huge question.
I mean, really, think about it. How is a nation born? Does it happen on a battlefield or in some parliamentary chamber? Or is it something that's forged over time in the hearts and minds of millions of people who share a common struggle? That right there is the core question we're going to explore.
All right, so here's our roadmap. We're going to break this incredible story down into 5 parts. We'll start with the very first sparks of rebellion, then see how an idea of India began to form. We'll ride the Gandhian wave, get into the final intense struggle, and then, well, we'll look at the bittersweet moment of freedom and partition.
So let's set the scene. We're in the mid-1800s. Long before there was any kind of organized national movement, the ground beneath the British Raj was already shaking. These were the first tremors of a massive earthquake that was on its way.
You know, sometimes all it takes is one person, one single act. In 1857, a sepoy, a soldier named Mangal Pandey, fired at his superior officer. Now, this wasn't just some random act of violence. It was the match that lit a fuse. Years of simmering anger over everything from pay to cultural disrespect to aggressive British expansion just exploded into a massive revolt that swept across the country.
And it wasn't just the soldiers who were angry, not by a long shot. Look at these 2 examples from right around the same time. On one hand, you have the Santal tribal communities rising up against corrupt officials and moneylenders. On the other, you've got peasant farmers in Bengal refusing to be pushed into poverty by European indigo planters. The takeaway here is pretty clear. From the forests to the farmlands, people had had enough.
So, you've got all this scattered anger, all these protests. How does that turn into a unified movement? Well, the next phase is all about channeling that raw energy into organized politics. It became a struggle fought not just with weapons, but with ideas.
And this is where the Indian National Congress steps onto the stage. Its founding in 1885 was a huge turning point. You see, the early leaders had this really powerful idea. They didn't just assume India was already one unified nation. Instead, they said, no, India is a nation in the making. The very act of struggling together against the same opponent is what would forge that common national identity. Pretty smart, right?
But you can't build a movement on just an idea, right? You need a solid argument. And that's where the drain theory was just brilliant. This wasn't some vague complaint. It was a detailed economic takedown. Nationalists like Dadabhai Naoroji laid it all out, arguing that British rule was basically a giant system designed to suck wealth out of India and send it to Britain. This gave the movement an incredibly powerful case against colonialism.
Okay, so they had a goal, but how to get there, well, that was a whole other story. Right from the start, there was this big split in the Congress. You had the moderates, who believed in a slow and steady approach, petitions, debates, working within the system. But then you had the extremists, who were like, no way. They wanted mass action, boycotts, and their ultimate goal was Swaraj, complete and total self-rule. This argument would shape the movement for years.
The next big shift, the thing that really changed the game, came with the arrival of one person, a man who would take this political debate and turn it into a genuine mass movement that just swept across the entire nation.
And that person, of course, was Mahatma Gandhi. He came back to India with this revolutionary new idea he had developed in South Africa, Satyagraha. It literally means truth force. It was a way for the masses to struggle, built on nonviolence and civil disobedience. Now, this wasn't about being passive. It was active, principled resistance, and it was a philosophy that would empower millions of people. So what did that look like in real life? Well, the non-cooperation movement was a masterclass in strategy. It was a brilliant 3-pronged attack. First, you hit the colonial economy where it hurts. Boycott foreign cloth. Second, you cripple the administration. Students leave their schools, lawyers leave their courts. And finally, you take away their legitimacy. You give back their titles and honors. The whole point was to make it impossible for the British to rule, all without firing a single shot.
But what did all this political talk about Swaraj or self-rule actually mean to the person on the street? This quote from a Bombay mill worker, Arjun Atmaram Alway, is just incredibly powerful. For him, independence wasn't some lofty, abstract idea. It meant an end to being in debt. It meant the oppression would stop. It meant better wages and just basic human dignity. That's what they were fighting for.
So by the 1930s and 40s, the movement had incredible strength and support from people all over the country.
The stage was now set for the final showdowns that would finally bring an end to British rule.
The Salt March in 1930 was just a brilliant piece of political theater. I mean, making your own salt to protest a colonial tax? It showed the whole world how absurd the British position was, and it galvanized the entire nation. But as World War II engulfed the British Empire, the time for symbolic protest was coming to an end. A final, absolute demand was about to be made.
And that brings us to 1942, the absolute breaking point. With the world at war, Gandhi issued the ultimate ultimatum: quit India. And his message to the people was just as direct: do or die. Almost immediately, the entire Congress leadership was thrown in jail. But instead of crushing the movement, it just exploded into the spontaneous, leaderless rebellion, proving that the people themselves were now the ones in charge.
And this people power, this ability to mobilize, it didn't just appear out of nowhere. It had been building for decades. To get a sense of the scale, just look at this number. This is from way back in 1921. 140,000 workers in Bombay going on strike, shutting the city down. That incredible capacity for mass action, built up over years of struggle, was the engine behind the Quit India movement.
Okay, so the war ends, and the British make a huge miscalculation. They decide to put captured soldiers from the Indian National Army, men who had fought against them alongside the Japanese, on trial for treason. They thought it would be a show of force, but boy did that backfire, spectacularly.
As Jawaharlal Nehru put it, the INA trials did something unbelievable. They united the entire country. Instead of seeing these soldiers as traitors, everyone, from Congress supporters to Muslim League members, even people in the British Indian Army, saw them as patriots. This massive wave of unity was the final nail in the coffin. It showed the British that their authority was completely gone.
And so the end of the empire was finally here. But the conclusion to this 100-year story would be anything but simple. It was a new dawn of freedom, yeah, but it was a dawn tragically divided by conflict and loss.
The last few years were just a blur of activity. In 45, a new government in Britain says, okay, we're committed to independence. By 46, with mutinies in the Navy, British authority is crumbling. An interim government is formed. And then, in 47, the plan is announced: transfer of power and partition. Finally, on August 15, 1947, after a century of struggle, India was free.
So why did they finally pack up and leave? Well, fundamentally, they had lost the war of position. They had lost the battle for hearts and minds. And more importantly, the very pillars of their rule, the Indian officials, the police, the soldiers, they couldn't be trusted anymore to enforce a system that the people had so completely rejected.
But, and this is a huge but, this victory was scarred by an immense tragedy. The decision to partition the subcontinent into India and Pakistan unleashed horrific violence, and it led to one of the largest, most painful mass migrations in all of human history. Freedom had arrived, but it came at a devastating cost.
And that leaves us with this final, really tough question to think about. The 100-year struggle did it. It won, it achieved its goal of an independent nation. But what was lost along the way? What were the unintended consequences of this long, difficult, and ultimately triumphant journey? That's a question that continues to shape the subcontinent to this very day.